There is a hidden pattern woven into the very fabric of our economy, a rhythm that most people will never, ever see. It is not something taught in our schools. Your financial advisors will not speak of it. The mainstream media ignores it with a deliberate and complete silence. But this singular pattern, this ghost in the machine, has predicted every single major economic collapse for the last 200 years with an accuracy that is nothing short of terrifying. It foretold the devastating crash of 1870 Gen 3. It called out the year 1920 Gen 9 with chilling precision. It signaled the global meltdown of 2008. And right now, at this very moment, that exact same pattern is pointing its finger directly, unequivocally, at the year 2020 Gen 6. Not 2020 Gen 7. Not sometime vaguely in the future. 2020 Gen 6. The mathematics behind this are precise. The historical evidence is entirely undeniable, and if you can grasp what is truly happening beneath the surface of the daily news, you can see the crash coming months, even years, before the rest of the world begins to panic. This is not about indulging in conspiracy theories or engaging in baseless fear-mongering. This is about cycles. It is about powerful economic cycles that repeat with the silent regularity of the seasons. Just as winter inevitably follows autumn, and spring follows winter, so too does economic collapse follow an economic boom with a kind of mathematical certainty. The specific cycle we are going to examine in detail today was first discovered by a brilliant Russian economist named Nikolai Kondratieff. Back in the 1920s, he dedicated himself to studying vast amounts of economic data, reaching all the way back into the 1700s. And in that mountain of information, he found something truly remarkable. He uncovered a long wave pattern, a grand economic tide that ebbs and flows, repeating itself approximately every 40 to 60 years. He identified 4 distinct phases, 4 economic seasons: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Growth, prosperity, stagnation, and finally, collapse. And as we speak, we are deep into the winter phase right now. The very phase that always, without a single exception in recorded history, ends in a profound financial crisis. Kondratieff did not just theorize about this powerful force. He meticulously documented it, using decades upon decades of hard data on prices, interest rates, industrial production statistics, and commodity prices. He demonstrated conclusively that these long waves were not just random fluctuations or chaotic market noise. They were predictable, recurring patterns driven by fundamental forces like technological innovation, the relentless accumulation of debt, and the creative destruction of old, obsolete economic structures to make way for the new. His work was so frighteningly accurate and so deeply threatening to the official Soviet narrative of permanent communist prosperity that Joseph Stalin himself had him arrested in the year 1930. Nikolai Kondratieff died in a brutal labor camp in 1930 Gen 8, but his cycle, his discovery, lived on, and it has been proven right again and again and again. Let me show you exactly how this works. The Kondratieff wave always begins with spring. This is the post-in-crisis recovery phase. Infret is being rebuilt from the ground up. Powerful new technologies begin to emerge from the ashes of the old, shattered economy. Crucially, debt levels are low because the preceding crisis destroyed most of the bad debt and wiped the slate clean. Interest rates are low, prices are stable, and a sense of cautious but growing optimism begins to permeate society. This is precisely what happened in the aftermath of the Second World War. The 1950s were a classic spring phase. America rebuilt, the suburbs expanded explosively, the interstate highway system was constructed, and the television became a mainstream fixture in every home. The economy was growing robustly, but inflation remained modest and under control. Then comes the summer, the glorious boom years. The technologies that were first introduced during the spring now mature and spread throughout the entire economy, transforming society. Employment is high, wages are rising steadily, and inflation starts to pick up as consumer demand begins to outpace supply. Everyone feels wealthy. The stock market climbs ever higher, seemingly without end. This was the 1960s, the space race, the golden age of American manufacturing, high employment, rising wages, and a pervasive, growing confidence that this newfound prosperity was permanent and unbreakable. But beneath the shimmering surface of the boom, serious problems are developing. Debt levels are quietly rising. Inflation is starting to accelerate. The seeds of the next darker phase are being sown. Autumn arrives next. This is the plateau phase, the great topping gen out process. The economic peak has been reached, but almost nobody wants to admit it. Economic growth slows to a crawl. Inflation becomes a serious, persistent problem. In response, Central banks begin to raise interest rates to fight that inflation, which in turn slows the economy even further. Asset prices, like stocks and real estate, become dangerously detached from their underlying fundamental values as people begin to chase rampant speculation instead of making productive, long-term investments. And all the while, debt continues to accumulate at an alarming rate, because everyone still believes the boom will soon return. This was the 1970s and the early 1980s, the era of stagflation, high inflation, combined with sluggish growth, oil shocks, rising unemployment, and a general feeling that the economy was stuck in the mud. And it was stuck in the autumn phase, heading inexorably towards winter. Winter is the crisis phase. It is the great unraveling. The accumulated debt from the previous seasons suddenly becomes unpayable. Asset bubbles pop with shocking speed. Banks begin to fail. Unemployment spikes dramatically. A deep deflation or severe recession takes hold of the entire system. This is the Great Reset, the moment where all the excess and malinvestment of the previous phases are brutally purged from the system. Business that survived only on cheap, easy credit finally go bankrupt. Over-leveraged investors lose everything they have. Only those who saw the signs and prepared for the arrival of winter survived to see the next spring. This was the early 1930s, the Great Depression. Thousands of banks failed. Unemployment hit a staggering 20% The stock market collapsed by 80% from its peak. It took a full 20 years for stocks to recover to their 1920 levels. That is, a Kondratieff Winter. But the cycle does not stop there. After every winter, a new spring is born, the 1950s and 60s, as we mentioned. Then summer again in the 1970s, autumn in the 80s and 90s, and winter arrived with brutal force in 2008 with the global financial crisis. But here is the critical point, the single most important detail to understand about our current situation. The 2008 crisis should have been much, much worse. It should have been a full Kondratieff Winter, a complete cleansing of the system. Instead, governments and central banks around the world intervened with a level of force never before seen in human history. They bailed out the banks. They slashed interest rates to zero. They printed trillions upon trillions of dollars out of thin air. They effectively prevented the natural winter from running its full necessary course. What they actually did was delay winter, not cancel it. They postponed the inevitable. And that means the winter that was supposed to fully unfold between 2008 and 2010 is still coming. It has been held back for more than 15 years through the most extreme and artificial monetary policy and debt expansion imaginable. But you cannot postpone winter forever. Eventually, the accumulated imbalances become so massive, so distorted, that no amount of government intervention can prevent the Great Correction. That point is now rapidly approaching. The year 2020-6 sits at the precise intersection of multiple powerful cycles, all of them pointing toward the very same conclusion. The delayed Kondratieff Winter is finally about to arrive. Let Tornum look at the specific hard evidence. The original Kondratieff Wave had an average length of about 50 to 60 years from peak to peak. The last major peak, the point where autumn transitioned to winter, occurred in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now add 50 to 60 years to that. What do you get? The period from 2020 to 2030. We are in the window right now, but we can achieve even more precision if we examine the subgen cyclers that operate within this long wave. The debt supercycle, which overlays the Kondratieff Wave, suggests that maximum debt saturation, the point at which the system can no longer physically absorb any additional borrowing, occurs roughly every 70 to 80 years. The last time this happened was between 1930 and 1940, during the depths of the Great Depression. Add 70 to 80 years to that, and you get the period between 2010 and 2020. We have already passed deep into the danger zone, but there is another crucial cycle at play here, the generational cycle. Every 80 to 90 years, roughly the length of a single human lifetime, societies collectively forget the painful lessons of the previous great crisis. The people who actually lived through the Great Depression and understood its root causes are now gone. The current generation has absolutely no lived experience of a true systemic economic catastrophe. This lack of memory creates the perfect psychological conditions for repeating the exact same mistakes. The last generational crisis peaked between 1920, Gen 9, and 1930, Gen 3. Add 80 to 90 years, and you land directly in the window of 2019 to 2020, Gen 3. The timing could not be more precise. These cycles do not operate in isolation. They reinforce each other when multiple powerful cycles align and point toward the same time period. The resulting crisis is exponentially more severe than if only one cycle were turning. Right now we have the Kondratieff long wave, the debt supercycle, and the generational cycle all converging on the exact same 5-year window. 2020 Gen 2 to 2020 Gen 7. And within that window, the most likely flashpoint based on meticulous subgen cycle analysis and current leading economic indicators is the year 2020 Gen 6. Not the beginning of 2020 Gen 6, not the end, but somewhere in the middle, late spring or early summer of 2020 Gen 6, when the system finally reaches its absolute maximum stress point. Now let me show you precisely why 2020 Gen 6 specifically. There are leading indicators embedded within these cycles that help us pinpoint the timing with greater accuracy. One of the most reliable is the yield curve inversion. This is a technical term for when short-term interest rates rise above long-term interest rates, creating an inverted curve on a chart. Every single recession since 1950 has been preceded by a yield curve inversion. There have been no exceptions and no false positives. The yield curve first inverted in July of 2020 Gen 2. It remained inverted for over 2 years, one of the longest and deepest inversions in history. It finally uninverted in September of 2020 Gen 4. Historically, recessions begin 6 to 18 months after the curve uninverts. September 2020 Gen 4 plus 6 to 18 months equals a window between March 2020 Gen 5 and March 2020 Gen 6. That is your window. Another powerful leading indicator is corporate credit spreads. This indicator measures the difference between what safe, stable borrowers pay for loans versus what risky, less stable borrowers pay. When these spreads are narrow, it means investors are not worried about risk. When the spreads widen dramatically, it signals that investors are fleeing to safety. Spreads always widen sharply right before a major economic downturn. Right now, after years of remaining artificially compressed, spreads are beginning to widen. The widening began in late 2020 Gen 3 and has been accelerating through 2020 Gen 4. Based on historical precedent, spreads begin to widen 12 to 20 Gen 4 months before the crisis truly hits. Late 2020 Gen 3 plus 12 to 20 Gen 4 months gives you a target of late 2020 Gen 5 to late 2020 Gen 6. A third indicator is the velocity of money. This measures how quickly money moves through the economy. When people and businesses are confident they spend money quickly, it changes hands multiple times, creating a flurry of economic activity. When confidence drops, people and businesses hoard cash, and the velocity of money slows to a crawl. Before every major recession in modern history, money velocity peaks and then starts a steady decline. The current peak occurred in early 2020 Gen 2. It has been declining ever since. The historical lag between a peak in money velocity and the onset of a recession is 20 Gen 4 to 30 Gen 6 months. Early 2020 Gen 2 plus 20 Gen 4 to 30 Gen 6 months equals a window from early 2020 Gen 4 to early 2020 Gen 5. We are already in that window right now, which means the recession could technically begin any time from now through early 2020 Gen 5, with the full and blown crisis developing by 2020 Joe blank. Consumer debt levels provide yet another timing signal. Household debt, when measured as a percentage of disposable income, rises throughout the boom phase and invariably peaks just before the crash. This happened in 2007, right before the 2008 crisis. It happened in 1980 Gen 9 before the early 90s recession. It happened in 2000, just before the dot-com crash. Right now, household debt is at near record levels. Credit card debt just hit all. 10-time highs. Auto loan debt is at record levels. Student loan debt is at record levels. Mortgage debt, relative to home values, is approaching dangerous zones once again. When debt service payments exceed 15% of disposable income, a crisis follows within 18 months. We crossed that very threshold in mids Gen 2020 Gen 4, mid to Gen 2020 Gen 4, plus 18 months equals a period between late 2020 Gen 5 and early 2020 Gen 6. Commercial real estate provides perhaps the most specific and alarming timing indicator of all. There is approximately $15 billion in commercial real estate loans that need to be refinanced between 2020 Gen 4 and 2020 Gen 7. The peak refinancing wall hits in 2020 Gen 5 and 2020 Gen 6. These loans were originated when interest rates were at 2 to 3%. They are now being refinanced at 7 to 9%. The buildings themselves simply cannot support the higher debt service payments. The quarter will cascade through the system when commercial real estate defaults reach a critical mass. Regional banks begin to fail. When regional banks fail, the credit markets freeze solid. When the credit markets freeze, the broader economy collapses. The refinancing cliff is steepest in the first and second quarters of 2020 Gan 6. That is your specific timing. But let's zoom out again to the bigger pattern. The Kondratieff Winter that was artificially delayed in 2008 created what economists now call the everything bubble. Normally, bubbles form in just one sector of the economy. It was real estate in 2008. It was technology stocks in 2000 in the 1920s. It was the stock market. But the unprecedented intervention after 2008 did not just inflate one bubble. It inflated everything all at once, simultaneously. Stocks hit all Gen-time highs. Bonds hit all Gen-time high. Real estate hit all Gen-time high. Cryptocurrencies appeared out of nowhere and created their own spectacular bubble. Even assets like fine art and collectibles reached absurd valuations. Everything inflated at once because the Federal Reserve was pumping money into the financial system at rates never before seen. This creates a unique and terrifying problem. When everything is in a bubble, there is nowhere to hide when that bubble pops. In 2008, bonds were a safe haven. In 2000, real estate was safe. In 1920, Gen 9 bonds eventually became safe after the initial shock. But in the coming crisis, everything deflates together, because everything was inflated together. This is what makes the coming 2020 Gen 6 crisis potentially worse than any previous Kondratieff Winter. The deep interconnection and correlation across all asset classes is completely unprecedented. The debt levels underlying this everything bubble are simply staggering. Global debt reached $307 trillion in 2020 Gen 3. That is 340% of global gross domestic product. In other words, the world owes 3.4 times its entire annual economic output. For perspective, United States debt to gross domestic product was 260% at the peak of the Great Depression in 1930 Gan 3. We are significantly higher now. Corporate debt in the United States alone is over $11 trillion. Much of this is so-called zombie debt, loans made to companies that can only afford to pay the interest on their debt, not the principal. These companies survive only because interest rates were kept artificially low for over a decade. As rates rise and stay elevated, these zombie companies will start failing in droves. When they fail, their lenders take massive losses. When lenders take losses, credit tightens for everyone. When credit tightens, even healthy companies cannot get the financing they need to operate. The cascade accelerates. Government debt deserves special attention because it is the very foundation of the entire financial system. United States federal debt is now $30 Gen 6 trillion and rising at an exponential rate. Annual interest payments on this debt now exceed $1.2 trillion. That is larger than the entire defense budget. It is larger than Medicare. The single biggest line item in the federal budget is now interest on past borrowing. This is fundamentally unsustainable, but as long as interest rates remained low, it was manageable. The problem is that interest rates are not low anymore. The Federal Reserve raised rates from 0 to over 5% in just 18 months. This is the fastest rate of increase since the early 1980s. As a result, the government's interest burden is exploding. Within 2 years, interest payments will exceed $2 trillion annually. Within 5 years, interest payments could consume a staggering 40% of all federal tax revenue. That is mathematically impossible to sustain. When a government debt reaches these levels, there are only 3 possible outcomes: default, which destroys the currency and the government's credibility; inflation, which destroys the currency and everyone's savings; or austerity, which causes a deep recession and widespread social unrest. All 3 options are terrible, but governments always choose inflation, because it is the most politically quiet and least visible way to reduce the real burden of the debt. You do not tell people you are defaulting, you just print money, create massive inflation, and then repay the old debt with new currency that is worth far less. This is what has happened in every previous Kondratieff Winter. Massive money printing followed by an eventual deflationary collapse as the system buckles under its own weight. The Federal Reserve is trapped. If they keep rates high to fight inflation, They will crash the economy and cause a catastrophic wave of defaults. If they lower rates and start printing money again, they will reignite inflation and destroy the currency. There is no good option left. They can choose pain now, or they can choose catastrophic pain later. Based on all historical precedent, central banks always choose to delay the pain, which only makes the eventual crisis that much worse. The Fed will likely start cutting rates in late 2020 again 4 or early 2020 again 5. This will provide a temporary relief rally. The markets will soar. People will think the worst is over, but this will be the final bubble before the burst. The last gasp of artificial prosperity before the delayed Kondratieff Winter finally arrives with full force in 2020 Gen 6. Let me walk you through what the unfolding of this crisis will likely look like based on the historical patterns of past Kondratieff Winters. The first phase is the crack. Something breaks. It might be the failure of a major bank. It might be a sovereign debt crisis erupting in Europe. It might be a collapse in the Chinese real estate market that spreads globally. It might be a series of major corporate defaults that suddenly spook the credit markets. The specific trigger does not really matter. What matters is that, after years of building pressure, a crack finally appears in the system. This initial crack usually happens 6 to 12 months before the full crisis hits, based on our timeline. This crack will likely appear in late 2020 Gen 5, or very early 2020 Gen 6. When the crack appears, authorities will immediately downplay it. They will call it an isolated problem, a one-gen time issue, nothing systemic. They will point to strong economic indicators and low unemployment figures. They will say the fundamentals are sound. This is exactly what they said in 2007, when the first subprime mortgage lenders started failing. It is what they said in 1920 Gen 9, after the market had several sharp drops earlier that year. The denial phase is a predictable part of the pattern. Authorities simply cannot admit the system is breaking, because that admission would accelerate the panic. So they deny, and deny, until denial becomes impossible. The second phase is contagion. The initial crack begins to spread. If a bank failed, depositors at other banks start getting nervous and pull their money. If a country defaulted, investors start questioning the solvency of other countries. If one corporate sector is in trouble, lenders start pulling back from all corporate borrowers, regardless of their health. Fear becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Credit markets freeze solid. Nobody wants to lend because nobody knows who is solvent and who is about to fail. This is precisely what happened in September of 2008 after Lehman Brothers collapsed. The credit markets completely froze. Companies could not even borrow money to make their weekly payroll. The entire global system nearly stopped functioning. The contagion phase usually lasts from 2 to 6 months. In our timeline, this would be the spring and early summer of 2020 Gen 6. The third phase is intervention. Governments and central banks finally panic. They throw everything they have at the problem. Interest rates are cut to zero or even pushed into negative territory. Trillions of dollars are printed. Banks are bailed out. New emergency lending programs are created overnight. Fiscal stimulus floods the economy. For a short time, the markets stabilize. People start to think the worst is over, but this is an illusion. The intervention does not solve the underlying problem of too much debt. It just papers over the cracks and delays the full impact. This phase can last from 3 to 12 months, depending on how aggressively the authorities intervene. In our timeline, this would be the summer, through the fall of 2020 Gen 6. The fourth phase is the secondary collapse. This is the moment when people finally realize the intervention did not work. The markets that had rallied on the stimulus start falling again, but this time they fall faster and farther because confidence has been completely broken. Unemployment starts rising rapidly. Corporate bankruptcies accelerate. Tax revenues collapse, forcing governments to borrow even more money just to maintain basic services. Social unrest begins to grow as people lose their jobs, their homes, and their savings. This phase is the very heart of the Kondratieff Winter. It typically lasts from 18 to 30 Gen 6 months. In our timeline, this would be from late 2020 Gen 6 all the way through 2020 Gen 8. The fifth and final phase is stabilization and reset. After the system has been thoroughly and painfully cleansed, after the bad debts have been liquidated, after the zombie companies have finally failed, and after asset prices have fallen back to levels supported by fundamentals rather than wild speculation. The survivors of the winter have capital assets, are incredibly cheap. New technologies are emerging. The next spring is ready to begin. But this phase only arrives after years of intense pain in our timeline. This would not occur until 2020 Gen 9 or 2030 at the absolute earliest. Now understanding this cycle is not about predicting every single twist and turn of the market. It is about recognizing that we are in the late stage of a major historic cycle and positioning yourself accordingly. The people who understand Kondratieff Winters do not try to time the exact top of the market. They prepare early. They build up large cash reserves during the autumn phase. They avoid taking on new debt. They do not chase speculative assets just because everyone else is getting rich. They accept a period of short-term underperformance in exchange for long-term survival and the once-in-a lifetime opportunity to buy assets at depression-level prices during the winter. History shows that those who position themselves correctly before a Kondratieff Winter can achieve truly generational wealth. The investors who had the courage to buy stocks in 1930 Gen 2 and 1930 Gen 3 at the very depths of the Great Depression saw returns that would never be matched again in normal times. The investors who bought real estate at foreclosure prices in 2009 and 2010 created fortunes that will last for generations. The opportunities that appear during Kondratieff Winters do not come around often, maybe once every 50 to 80 years. If you are prepared, if you have capital when everyone else is desperate, you can acquire high-quality assets at 20 to 30 cents on the dollar. Those assets eventually recover. The 20 cents becomes a dollar. That is a 500% return. But this preparation requires going against every single human instinct and ignoring all social pressure. During the autumn phase, which is where we are right now, everyone seems to be making money. Your neighbors are talking about their investment gains. The financial media celebrates new market highs. The experts on television say that this time is different, that new technology has changed the old rules. Staying liquid and cautious feels like you are missing out on the party. This is the great test. The people who can resist the overwhelming temptation to chase returns during the autumn are the ones who survive the winter and truly thrive in the next spring. The specific actions you should consider will depend on your personal situation. If you are heavily invested in stocks, historical precedent suggests reducing your exposure dramatically. This does not mean selling everything and going to cash, because some great companies will survive and even thrive, but it does mean reducing your allocation from, say, 90% stocks down to 40 or 50%, and using the proceeds to build a substantial cash position that can be deployed when prices collapse. If you own real estate, especially investment real estate purchased with debt, the math needs to be carefully evaluated. Can you service the debt if your rental income drops by 30%? If not, selling before the market turns might preserve equity that would otherwise completely evaporate. If you are carrying consumer debt like credit cards, auto loans, or personal loans, paying this down becomes the absolute top priority. Debt is an anchor in a winter. It forces you to sell your assets at the worst possible time just to make your monthly payments. Being debt-free provides incredible flexibility. You can wait out the storm. You can buy when others are being forced to sell. The wealthy understand this principle. They use debt strategically during the spring and summer to leverage their gains, but they shed that debt before winter arrives to avoid being trapped. For those with significant capital, this is the time to think about diversification in a completely different way. Not diversification across stocks and bonds, because both will likely fall together in a Kondratieff Winter, but diversification into assets that hold their value or even increase in value during periods of crisis. Physical gold and silver, productive farmland, energy-generating assets, and businesses that provide essential services regardless of economic conditions. These are not speculative plays. They are insurance policies against the collapse of paper asset values. The psychological preparation might be even more important than the financial preparation. Kondratieff Winters test your resolve like nothing else when everyone around you is panicking, when the media is predicting the end of capitalism, when your portfolio has fallen by 50% and is still falling. The temptation to give up and sell everything is overwhelming. This is precisely the moment when you need to be buying, not selling. But having the mental fortitude to act contrary to your own emotions requires preparation. Study previous crises. Read first-hand accounts from people who lived through the Great Depression. Understand that what feels like the end of the world is actually the reset that creates the opportunity. You must internalize this knowledge before the crisis hits, because in the heat of the moment, rational thought becomes very, very difficult. There is also the critical question of timing your preparation. If you start too early, you miss out on years of gains while waiting for a crash that seems like it will never arrive. If you start too late, you are selling into a falling market after most of the damage has already been done. The answer lies in gradual positioning. You do not wait for the crash to be obvious to everyone. You recognize that we are in the late autumn phase and begin to shift your assets systematically, selling 10 to 20% of your stock holdings each quarter, building your cash reserves with each paycheck, paying down your debt aggressively. By the time the first crack appears, you are already positioned. You are not trying to exit with a terrified crowd. The cycles we have discussed, the Kondratieff Wave, the debt supercycle, the generational cycle, are not absolute guarantees. They are probabilities, extremely high probabilities based on 200 years of detailed economic history. Could this time be different? Could new technology or novel policy responses finally break the cycle? It is theoretically possible, but it is deeply unlikely, because these cycles are not ultimately driven by technology or policy. They are driven by human psychology and the cold, hard mathematical limits on debt accumulation. Technology changes how we produce and consume. Policy changes how governments respond to a crisis. But neither changes the fundamental human pattern of boom, leading to bust, leading to recovery. What makes the 2020 Gen 6 convergence particularly compelling is that we can see the stress building in the system in real time. Commercial real estate defaults are rising. Bank reserves are tightening. Consumer savings rates are falling. Credit card delinquencies are increasing. Corporate profit margins are compressing. Each of these data points would be concerning in isolation. Together, they paint a crystal, gem-clear picture of an economy in the very late stage of a cycle. It is not collapsing yet, but it is showing all the classic warning signs that a collapse is approaching. The yield curve unjan version in September of 2020 Gen 4 was the starting gun. From that moment, the historical clock began ticking 6 to 18 months. That window closes in the spring of 2020 Gen 6. The commercial real estate refinancing crisis peaks. In the first half of 2020 Gen 6, the psychological factors of a winter arriving roughly 80 years after 1940 Gen 5 and 90 Gen 7 years after 1920 Gen 9 align perfectly in 2020 Gen 6. The delayed Kondratieff Winter, the one that was supposed to happen between 2008 and 2010 but was postponed by 15 years of unprecedented money printing, finally reaches its mathematical limit in 2020 Gen 5 to 2020 Gen 6, when the mountain of accumulated debt becomes impossible to service, even with artificially low rates. This is not prophecy, it is pattern recognition. The same patterns that predicted every major crisis for 2 centuries, the same cycles that turned winter into spring, spring into summer, summer into autumn, and autumn back into winter over and over again throughout all of modern economic history. We are not special. This generation is not different. The cycle continues. And right now, at the end of 2020 Gen 4, we are watching autumn turn into winter in real time. When 2020 Gen 6 arrives and the crisis finally unfolds, most people will claim that nobody could have seen it coming. They will say it was a black swan event, a completely unpredictable disaster. But it will not be unpredictable. It will be precisely what the cycles predicted. What the Kondratieff Wave mapped out decades ago, what the debt supercycle warned us about, what the generational cycle told us was rapidly approaching. The information was always there. The patterns were always clear. The only question was whether people were willing to see them. If you're watching this now, in late 2020 Gen 4 or early 2020 Gen 5, you do not have much time, but you have enough. Enough time to shift your portfolio, enough time to build your cash reserves, enough time to pay down your debt, enough time to prepare yourself mentally for what is coming. By this time next year, the crack will likely have appeared. The headlines will start getting nervous. By the spring of 2020 Gen 6, the contagion phase will be underway. By summer, the panic intervention will be in full force. By the fall, the secondary collapse will be obvious to everyone. That is the timeline, if the cycles are right. And the cycles have been right for 200 years. The crash is not coming to destroy your future. It is coming to reset the system, to purge the excesses, to liquidate the bad debts, and to make room for the next cycle of growth. Every Kondratieff winter has been followed by a glorious spring. Every crisis has eventually led to a powerful recovery. The question is not whether the system survives. It will. The question is whether you will survive with your capital intact and your understanding clear enough to recognize the generational opportunities that appear only during the chaos. That is what separates those who emerge from the winter wealthy from those who emerge broken. The hidden cycle that predicted 1920 Gen 9 and 2008 is now pointing directly at 2020 Gen 6. The mathematics are clear. The historical precedents are thoroughly documented. The warning signs are visible to anyone willing to look right now. The only thing left is the decision. Do you prepare while there is still time, or do you wait and hope that this time the cycle is wrong? History suggests that hoping against the cycle is a very, very expensive bet. The cycle does not care about hope. It just keeps turning. Winter is coming. The only question is whether you will be ready when it arrives. If you found this analysis tuckle, be sure to subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.